Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Doug Scott. Doug is an experienced therapist living in Dallas, Texas. He has a private counseling practice there and as well a master's in pastoral ministry. He's particularly interested in exploring a praxis that can help people in sort of the metamodern spirituality paradigm affect positive change in the world, and has some really fascinating tools and kind of conceptual tools he's developed in that vein. And Doug and I had the occasion to speak, I don't know, gosh, a couple months ago, maybe now at this point. And it was a wonderful conversation. And he was showing me his stuff. And I thought, this is really great. This would be helpful for people. And it'd be good to get this out in the world. So we thought we'd do a podcast on it. But thanks, Doug, for coming on the podcast and sharing this stuff with us.
Well, after this podcast, if I die, I will have been able to check this off of my coming on the Metamodern spirituality with you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. But no, what you've done is certainly far more important than any podcast appearances, and so I'm glad we can use this as sort of a medium to put that out in the world. Maybe let's just, as a starter, introduce yourself a little bit, so people have a little context of where you're coming from, what your background is, and this sort of work that you're interested in presenting to the world.
Yes, sir. It sounds good. Well, thank you. I was born actually in Saudi Arabia, and my parents lived there for 7 years. I was there for 4 years. And then we moved to the Dallas area, and I grew up in a rural town. Now it's so expensive, we could never live there. But after undergrad, I went to Nicaragua for 2 years with the Capuchin Franciscans. I was discerning maybe a Franciscan priesthood, grew up Catholic. And if I could remove a little bit of my arch conservative apologetical season in my life, or let's say incorporate it, it belongs.
Integrate it.
Integrate it. We're going to integrate the heck out of that. But growing up, I was always attracted to the mystical streams, not just of Christianity or Catholicism, but I was the kid, even in first grade, who would be attracted to things spiritual and always drawn to archetypal images of other religions. I had a UFO experience actually in first grade that was really powerful for me. And then right after that, I seemed like I started to have even more mystical encounters, numinous encounters with Mary and Mother Mary and Jesus and some of the saints. And it was, that would be too young for schizophrenia. So no, it wasn't that. But it was something that allowed me to feel that I had an important purpose, and there was a relational connection. I didn't know how to define those things other than my faith of experience at that point, but there was a relational connection of some kind of transcendent subject to subject, transcendent I, thou with others, as a part of a team, if you will. And then in Nicaragua, 2 years there, came back, went to Boston College for my graduate degrees, got married to somebody who was in medical school, my wife, and then we've moved back here, and we've lived in the Dallas area. And I have
and what were your graduate degrees?
I was a dual master's, so the credits cross-pollinated, so you could do 2 degrees in 3 years. Clinical social work, because I wanted to be a therapist, but the social work piece gives you training in locating people inside of a larger context, including the political. So I really valued that. And then the pastoral ministry piece was how to marry my 2 great interests in life, which is psychology and spirituality, and come together. So for those of your listeners who might be familiar with the likes of Richard Rohr, he would be a primary mentor of mine, a friend and mentor, and somebody that I've steeped myself in. No longer maybe Roman Catholic, but Roarian Catholic.
Meaning, so you there was a relationship there. When some people say mentor or very influenced by me, it would signal that they read a lot of his books or something like that. Yeah. But you had a direct personal
it's both and. Yes. Yeah. And I'll be on my way to Homebrewed weekend, whatever that is with the podcast. Yeah. I'll be stopping by in Albuquerque and spending a day with him. So yeah, very important for me. So I try to approach Christianity. I try to approach my vocation as a therapist and as a father and husband from this perspective of the transcendent and the immanent. a truly perennial position. And all of my delving into, let's say, the esoteric things that attract me, along with the exoteric expressions, all of these things actually have helped me to become a more joyful Christian. It's not that I'm throwing babies out with the bathwater, just fresh bathwater in a big old bath. Same baby.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, and so that's very fascinating stuff. I mean, there's a million things we could dive into in all of your personal story. I mean, I think though the counseling and the social work aspect and the ministry aspect are probably the most germane to I think what we'll be getting into here, because when we had our conversation, you were showing me some really fascinating kind of conceptual tools or maps to engage folks in a way that's kind of productive and builds connection and solidarity and these sorts of things. And I thought that was valuable. So I think for people, if to the degree we'll be getting into that, we'll have a sense for where that's coming from and kind of a background in psychology and in ministry and that sort of a thing. But I'm also I'm sure that all the other aspects of your biography, by all means, feel free to bring that into the mix and further contextualizing all this stuff. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, so that's helpful. So, and then, I mean, at this point, in terms of however you'd like to kind of put this stuff out there, I mean, I know you have some slides or something. Maybe you could start to share your screen and kind of dive into this setup, what this is, or however you'd like to introduce the models you're talking about.
Let me start by sharing the reason why I contacted you in the beginning.
Sure.
Because it is a praxis model that I want to talk about. And the way that I've come to understand any concepts or philosophy or theology or metaphysics is that if it doesn't lead to some form of embodied loving service, then as helpful as it might be, it's not fully, the fruit isn't full. It's not ripe. And so over the past 23 years, I have been working in the praxis area and trying to find how things like a universal Christianity or universal perennial tradition, how does that look like when I am walking together in life with my wife or with friends or with people, especially in today's polarity, how can we actually steward some sense of unity and wholeness below the false self-fighting that happened? And then my question always became, this is the past actually 5 years, and then we'll get into the slides. Right before I discovered your podcast, and which actually led me to Matt's work, and then Andrew Davis, and I've just dived right into Whitehead.
Matt Segal, you mean?
Yes, Matt Segal, right. I began thinking about this question. It just kept percolating up and then slowly formed into the ship's approach, which is what we'll be talking about today. And that is when somebody has come through counseling and then exited on the other side of that time, and they experience life at a more expansive level, particularly more joyful, able to handle tension more, the paradoxes, holding paradoxes together, and feel that their life has maybe an increased meaning. Even if nothing external in their life has changed, their capacity to participate with some level of hope and joy, if that is increased, then my question is, are there patterns that could be common here to have led from entering into counseling and an exit? Likewise, if someone is interested in a particular faith tradition and works inside of that tradition and finds themselves, again, with a more expansive capacity to love the neighbor, love God, and love the self, and pray for enemies, these things. If that's the case and there's transformation present, does it match the same patterns that I'm seeing in counseling? And finally, I would think that in my own life, how have I moved from where I might have been in a more rigid place as development unfolds naturally to where I'm at now and where I hope to be moving and becoming in the future? Does that also follow? And I think that there's probably a million different kinds of ways to express this, but my best way to do it is what I'm going to be presenting today. And it's not only something that I'm hoping helps people like yourself, myself, people who feel this call to have a legacy, help people love and serve more. Not only that, but the very thing that I'm using to help people is the thing that I'm teaching people to do in their life.
Mhm.
Because I think this is how we feel less anxious and less depressed and enjoy life more. So that's why I wanted to connect with you, because in this sense, it's very metamodern, and it's extremely Christian, and it's extremely Buddhist. I hope, and this is my own privileged white male from Texas saying here, I'm hoping that this is perennial enough that people can see that it's efficacious. And if it's not, I hope we can discard it and then find something that works.
Awesome. No, that's great. That's wonderful framing. And I mean, yeah, anytime one is looking for patterns, as you say, meaningful transformation across a wide data set, I guess you could say, right? Different traditions, different contexts, looking for enduring patterns. I think to the degree that one finds real things there, you're going to stumble upon these sort of, meta level conceptual frameworks or praxeological frameworks that, can help people actually in their lives, but also can, in a sense, help people make sense of also what is sort of the shared commonalities that exist between traditions and some of the shared transformational work that happens in counseling, but also in the spiritual life. And, so a lot of cross-pollination there in interesting ways. And yeah, I think the search for patterns at that scale is definitely something that folks like you and I are interested in, and people, in kind of meta theoretical circles generally are too. So no, that's wonderful. All right, well then, yeah, by all means,
Okay.
and
Jumping in.
go ahead and share your screen. And
all right, and let me just press. All right. Well, I'm calling this the ship's approach. And what I'm going to be doing with you today, if I can, is I'll introduce the acronyms and do a brief overview so that if people are listening and they pick up the overview and the acronyms at first, and that's all they get to, hopefully that'll be enough. But if people want to move a little bit deeper in, that's also room for you and I to continue a dialogue at the second half of this podcast. Does that sound okay?
Good.
The ship's approach is a model that we can remember in the acronyms. But instead of starting with the S, I actually start with the I in the middle. So when I'm writing down or typing out the ship's approach, I put the I as an exclamation point to draw attention that that's where we always start. And it's something that happens in between each of the other letters in the acronym. So it's primary that we start with the I, and the I stands for interview. It stands for interview. And it can be understood as interview the way that you and I might interview for a job. But it also can be understood as interview in the sense of sharing views. So interfaith is sharing faith, interview in that way. But if I could be a little clever here and think of interview as entering the view or the worldview or the viewpoint of the other. And I'm just going to say right off the bat, this skill is probably the hardest part because it requires a super decent amount of self-awareness to enter the view of the other, especially if I'm connecting with somebody that I have a shared history and it's been a little bit hostile or the edges are pretty rough, or entering the view of the other and somebody that I don't know a lot about or have similar backgrounds to. I don't think of course, I'll never know what it means to be you. I certainly don't know what it means to be, say, a black female, but I do know what it means to be a human who is at some sense both broken and whole, or made in the image of God in the fullness of that divinity. But my likeness of God is that travail. It is that developmental side. So I'm working to help my likeness match the the image, something like that. And it requires a lot of self-awareness, because ultimately it's not that ultimately one sees themselves as an agent or steward of wholeness. You see, so it's no longer I'm learning so much as who am I and what's my purpose. It's almost as if I could put it in this way, one achieves some level of enlightenment or whatever. I'm not saying I'm enlightened. I'm just saying the big tasks of who am I are resolved enough to say, well, who I am is somebody who desires to be a channel or an instrument of love and wholeness. And so it's with that energy, almost like putting on the mind of Christ, as the Apostle Paul would say. Or another way to say it is, no longer I, but Christ who lives within me. Some sense of a wholeness speaking through me and connecting to other elements of this wholeness and helping them achieve some gnosis of wholeness in their life. I'm just going to stop there and ask you if that makes sense or resonates.
Yeah, definitely. I also, I've just been kind of taking the role of the audience here. I'm also not sure if, with the slides being shown, if my video will appear at all. So I'm sort of a disembodied voice potentially, but yes, no, very much so. And to the degree that, let's say, self-reflection and self-awareness are crucial aspects of sort of developmental expansion and insight, I think that's entirely fitting with my experience and a lot of the stuff that I've been reading about in that field as well. And I think that the meaningful connection that you're drawing with the spiritual tradition, at least of Christianity specifically, but also others, I would presume, that's also a key aspect as well of being able to, relate to the other in a meaningful way, that, of course, the ethical language of the traditions that can be framed in very different terms, but I think is all getting at sort of the same thing. And in some ways, kind of what Kant was talking about, of taking people as ends rather than means, and also being able to kind of see the world from their eyes, and the necessity, the importance of being able to consider the other in terms of the self and all that. I mean, I could go ramble on, but the point is, yeah totally, it's on track.
You are speaking my language more eloquently, though, of course. I would say that I don't think transformation happens any other way. And I see a lot of people in my office. As I said, I've been a counselor for 23 years. I shaved off my beard, but it's real white. Usually that gives me a lot of cred to let them know that at least he's been around. But I would say that when I have seen 60-year-olds, 50-year-olds in my office who have achieved a fairly decent high level of success in our society, are esteemed in business or so forth, struggling, yes, in maybe their emotional life or mental health. But when I am able to discern their sense of the imago Dei, the image of God, the operational theology, I'm often surprised that there's not a lot of development there. That a lot of us are still operating from what might be seen as a Zeus figure in the sky, which is interesting because if you take Dios, God in Spanish, or Deus, God in Portuguese, Deus, for example, is basically Zeus, but just remove the D and put the Z. It's infiltrated our cultures so much that it's hard not to see God as an old man with a beard, just Santa Claus figure, And a lot of people are operating from a theology that doesn't have a very good anthropology. Humans are sinful. It's completely and totally fallen. That this creation, by implication, therefore, is fallen, not good, even though in Genesis, it is good, it is good, it is good. And so what I'm thinking here is when people transform from an earlier stage spiritual operational theology, when people transform from that, it will never be concepts, or maybe unless you're a 5 on the Enneagram. I'm just joking. It'll likely not be concepts or theological frameworks that bring people into something else. It's going to be relationship. It's going to be, am I well met by somebody else? And can I feel okay in being vulnerable, being myself that doesn't have it all together in that person's presence, because they see the anchored self inside of me instead of the floating self that's just on the surface trying to dance my little dance, It's those kinds of people. I don't care how smart they are or what kind of degree they have, doesn't matter. If they've done their work in whatever way, then you're in the presence of an expanded person when you feel inside your own gut. And this is something you feel in body. You feel in your body an okayness. And that is what I'm after in the ship's approach. Can we be that for people? So I's interview, we're going to move right into, if you're listening, picture the eye as a mast on a ship. So it's really tall and there's a ship. And without the mast, of course, we don't move in the water. There's no sail, you see. So the mast is very important, and it's connecting now, if you're imagining it, to the S on ships. It's connected to the first letter. And this is to enter into solidarity. And it's so important to enter the view of the other, the worldview, and then getting a sense of entering into the solidarity of the other that, and this is how I sort of see it in my own head, is that my goal is after my encounter with somebody, and that could be 5 minutes in Walmart at the cashier. It could be 5 minutes at Starbucks. Doesn't matter. Or it could be 5 years with a client in counseling. Can that person, when they leave our engagement, can that person feel that they were seen? Even if they thought Doug is crazy as a loon, or I disagree, or he misses a lot of points, could it be that person feels that, but my God, I felt connected? Even if that remains on the subconscious or unconscious level. You see, solidarity is this sense that we're all in it together. It's an accompaniment. Pope Francis's big legacy, I think, that he will leave is this sense of walking together, accompanying each other, pilgrims on the road. And I think Ram Dass, what did he say? We're all walking each other home. uh-huh. And feel free, Brendan, if you are familiar with other faith traditions that have similar kinds of notions of it all being one body, members of this one body, and being actively connected to each member, that's that spirit of solidarity. Yeah. So if you can...
Well, I mean, for me, I think of the bodhisattva in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, someone who doesn't look at enlightenment as something for themselves alone, but in a sense isn't really achieved unless everyone achieves it. And so even though they, through their own capacities, might be able to, in their kind of mythos, leave samsara and sort of check out of the system, it's sort of, they choose to come back to help others out of solidarity for humanity, because as long as there's suffering in the world, they don't feel like it is the right thing to sort of leave people behind, as it were. That's how I interpret sort of the bodhisattva vow in the Buddhist Mahayana tradition. So that's just one example that comes to mind.
I couldn't agree more. That's often one that I use as well. And let me just say as a side note too, one of the things that I have seen a lot, especially in New Age circles, is this sense, and maybe some Western people are trying to understand Buddhism, but from a pretty Western perspective, is the sense of just trying to reach nirvana, as you say, trying to reach the end and check out. In other words, to ascend beyond all of it. And I don't know how not to see this, and it could be that I'm just not very advanced in my own thinking, but it feels like, okay, once you've enlightened, then if you're going to be enlightened and one with all, that quote, one with all is that which becomes. So get busy becoming. In other words, re-enter the fray, this time as both the thou and the I. I am that. It's be that intentional channel that comes in and moves and shakes. That's solidarity. Yeah. So the path upwards to ascend is actually to incarnate more. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, once we've connected and entered into the view of somebody else, and there's a sense of shared humanity, not that it is messy, but that messiness is precisely how love becomes, and the very harmony of material existence. I think it's composed of a lot of asymmetry. It's that you're balancing the 3 and the 4 and the 3 and the 4, and the whole thing is one. It's the circle. Just as a side note, I'm always picturing geometry, sacred geometry in my head. I think it's a neurosis or synesthesia. I'm not sure. But I'm always seeing a dance between a square of stability and harmony, and then that's broken open by a sacred triangle that breaks it open. And all of this is inside of a big torus, like a sphere that just keeps rotating and moving. So everything is contained in one unity, one expanding sense of becoming. But inside of that, it's this dance of perichoresis, of the square, the harmony, and then the beauty of the moving into asymmetry. You know what I mean? I don't...
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, let me see. Wait, real quick. I'm going to see if I can. There we go. Yeah, I didn't want to be his disembodied voice. So.
Oh, yeah, because this is about embodiment. Good job.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, images like that can be helpful for sure. I have some particular kind of visualizations that speak to me, but I think, holding those things as helpful kind of guides for thinking about these sorts of processes can be valuable. But there are multiple sacred geometries, and I think they all kind of reveal or emphasize certain aspects of reality in different ways that can be helpful. So I try not to overly prioritize or essentialize or reify any one of those, but work with them as sort of helpful mnemonics or tools or something.
On the other hand, it seems to me that there, especially people that you talk to and people that I would trust and honor that they're doing some really good metaphysics, is that there seems to be an asymmetry is a part of a greater symmetry, and all of them are connected inside of a whole. I wonder if that's perennial. What do you think?
That's interesting. I mean, so when I think sacred geometries, a couple come to mind. There's the Kabbalah tree of life. Mm-hmm. There's the seed of life and the whole kind of circles that become the different configurations that build on top of each other. Then there's Neoplatonic kinds of frames. And then for me personally, a lot of fractal geometry and kind of Mandelbrot set, that sort of stuff, and stuff that comes out of chaos theory is for me kind of the most attractive sort of sacred geometry personally. And then you get cymatic. So anyway, there's a lot of different kinds. Oh, I mean, and by Neoplatonic, there's the original Platonic, sacred geometry, which goes back to the Pythagoreans. And so there's a lot of diversity there. But I mean, I would say, yeah, there's a sense of, let's say, I definitely get a sense that there's an integration going on across these systems of parts into greater wholes. That seems to be a kind of universal theme. And
I'm gonna go right there, because where you're at right there is part of hope.
Okay, great.
So let's just jump in.
I knew I was making a brilliant segue with my reference to sacred geometry. So
you and I are surfing on the same wavelength. It's way below the regular ocean, hidden. Okay. The way I'm understanding hope here is actually informed by the law of three. Gurdjieff talks about the law of three, and I've written about the law of three as well. I think it's the very energy and the thrust behind eternal becoming. And what I mean by the law of three, some traditional names is the affirming force, the denying force, and the reconciling force. That there's always a contrast, which sometimes we would interpret as a conflict. But there's a contrast, and in that tension is the begetting of, or the birth of some kind of reconciliation that takes us into a new order, a higher state. Yeah. But I've changed the words a little bit because it's a neuroses of mine for sure, is how to make this teachable. And so I'm trying to, instead of saying affirming force, denying force, I was wondering if status quo force Status quo force, that which is current. And then we have the contrasting force, which together create a contrast. So something that stops the status quo.
I will say status quo force is a terrible name for like a superhero band. Yeah, like we are status quo force. But no, I like that.
Or, it could be like a great band, and then the subtitle is Changing the World by Our Humility.
Yeah.
Yeah. Going to write a book. You and I should write a book about how to change the world.
I think we should start a children's television show personally. But no.
Yeah, good. We could riff. Okay. So hope is something that a ship's practitioner is really going to look to do. Here's why. The world, I'm assuming you need hope. We can live without a lot of things. But when I hear people talk about meaning and purpose, crisis of all of those things and all of that, I agree. And I think the way that we might traditionally, the term would be we need hope. Hope for something, hope that something more beautiful or something more whole that is lurking in the future is also present right now. So this is where I want to go with, because there's a specific kind of way that really works to help people cultivate, we as ship practitioners cultivating hope in somebody else, because the seeds of hope are in every person, in my opinion, and at every crisis they may feel, or every moment of contrast where you have the status quo force and the contrasting force, that tension that starts to build there's always going to be the seeds of hope right there in the soil of that crux. Yeah. And I can just say it as maybe even as a metaphysical truth. Try it out for yourself, even when you feel like there's no hope. When somebody says that, I often ask them, I have a Harry Potter magic wand in my office, so I said, don't make me bring out my wand. But I say,
you didn't mention wizardry as one of your prior.
Let me tell you something. There's an esoteric stream, which is most of my life, that people I got fired from the University of Dallas, a very Catholic conservative school, because they found my blog where I explore things like aliens and magic and all of this stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah. But so maybe another time we could move in this. But it doesn't matter if we can't incarnate that. So that's what Ships is about. Being Gandalf to others. And the hope is this. When I ask people, when I'm in solidarity and I can affirm where they're at, and it's difficult situations perhaps, I ask people if you could imagine what it would look like in maybe a month or 2 months, where the highest and greatest results, like if you were to pick a path, walk down that, and it would result in something that maybe you can't imagine, but it could feel like a respite, or you can feel a sense of well-being, peace, then what might that look like? So I'm asking these questions, open-ended questions, and here's something I just want to put in right here for those of us who might be visual, is exactly right there. When I say what it might look like, they may not be able to imagine the imagery of what a future goodness would look like, or future experience of joy. But I guarantee you, 9 out of 10 times, they can imagine what color it would be. I know that sounds weird, but whenever I ask someone, I say, okay, you can't picture it, but I'm going to ask you right now, feel into that. And if you could put a color to what that experience of wholeness or joy or whatever looks like in the future, what color would that be? And what color are you at right now?
Yeah. Are you asking me?
No, I'm not. I'm just.
Oh, okay. Rhetorical.
And what's so strange, and maybe perhaps not strange for people who work in these kind of energetic realms, is that I have extraordinarily conservative Christians and extraordinarily crazy new agey people and atheists and all of that whenever I ask them to move into the realms of the color, they match some magical traditions that I am familiar with, in terms of, red might mean this and golden might mean that. It is uncanny, because there's something metamodern or something perennial that's happening there. People are, if I could be a little esoteric, people are tapping into subtle realms. And mostly they might even say they don't believe in subtle realms, Maybe they think that's heretical, astral realms or something like that. But if I can get them to imagine,
to be the the resident critic, I suppose,
Sure.
as well, critiquer, skeptic,
of course,
which I think is always valuable to throw that in there. I mean, I don't think anything is detracted per se from the significance of these sorts of things if we also just appreciate that people might have psychological associations based on experience that hold true across different contexts and different cultures. Fire is hot and red and orange, will remind people of fire, and so energy, and so you can imagine a whole number of semantic associations that go on. And so, if someone thinks about where they are, where they'd like to be, I mean, they've done cross-cultural studies around like mood and color and the cool tones versus hot tones, all this stuff, right? Like, I don't know. I'm very comfortable being like, oh, there are some interesting and important kind of cross-cultural similarities, but might come across from other kinds of abstractions that we do with our minds and the worlds based on our experience, without necessarily jumping to subtle realms.
I'm really glad you picked that up, because I'm going to admit that I have a bias. I have chosen a certain kind of delusion, and this delusion helps me to be more loving to myself and more loving to others, and appreciating the ingratitude, even times of sorrow. So I'm smoking that all the time.
Okay, yeah. Well, then that sounds very metamodern. I mean, if there's a mythos that enhances your flourishing and the people around you, then I think that and by mythos, again, I don't want to say,
no, for
me, that does not connote falsity per se. It's just mythos is the whole set of imaginal, and praxis-based sort of, I don't know, engagements that we do as people that bring in the meaning in a rich way into our lives. And, there's all sorts of ways in which trying to be overly literal or historical or, scientific about things can detract from that. And I think that's that shouldn't be the point of the move of trying to question and critique, but the awareness, again, going back to that self-awareness bit, I think is valuable to, like, there's also a difference, I think, and an important one, between folks who see that they are engaged in a mythos and doing so intentionally for the sake of enhancing flourishing, rather than just assuming the mythos to be the background reality that is there. Because if you engage that differently, you're going to actually often detract from the flourishing. If people think that their mythos is right and it is the mythos for everyone, then every encounter is about trying to prove this and this sort of thing. You can imagine that that's the kind of rigidity you were talking about trying to move beyond in some of that developmental stuff earlier. And so I think, being aware of the kinds of relationships that we have to these things is always an important aspect of the kind of metamodern approach.
And I think we should probably try to have one relationship with something transcendent. I don't really care what it is. My metric is if someone just discovered, trad Catholicism, which a lot of people are doing right now, or discovered the law of one material. I don't care, because it's great for you, but here's always the metric I come back is, how is this helping me or you love and accept and understand yourself, understand others, loving service, and praying for our enemies? It's almost that simple. It's not easy, but it is almost that simple. That is a universal metric, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, hope is right there. What we do is we want to enter into what helps that person feel hope. And I'm going to offer this to people right now, is a lot of us have at least 3 bedrock values that we live in, first principles, but we often are not consciously aware of these things. They hang out in the subconscious. So if there's an iceberg, it's right below the water, And I'll give you an example. I know my dad will never listen to this. I love my dad. We have a great relationship, so I don't mind sharing this. And I've told him before, I've shared some of these things with people, and he's like, okay. When he and I had a conversation about a couple of months ago, he's 75, and I wanted to try the ship's approach with him to develop this common bond. We already have a common bond, but to make it articulated, he and I see things very, very differently politically. Our worldviews are very different. Yet there's a common bond. And that's what I think the ship's approach is trying to do, is get underneath and connect. And so I told him in different ways, but I said, basically, Dad, I think at this point I have a postdoctorate level of what you are against. And maybe I'm that way too, or other people, is that we're really quick to share with others, well, it could have been better, or darn those people, they're not doing this or that. We're really quick to be able to articulate what we're against. But that presupposes, I think, that there is something there that we're for. What are we for? Because if we didn't have that to begin with, then we wouldn't know what to be against. Even though we're really quick to share that, I'm hoping that we can start to become more, have readier access to that which we're for. What's our sacred yes first? And then we can talk about the sacred no. So part of the hope piece is to help people to find and articulate their values. And I always pick 3 because, there might be more, but usually there's going to be something like 3. And the way I often do it is, if you were to die and you were at your funeral and you had some capacity to hear and listen to a group of your loved ones that are gathered, and they're talking about how much they loved you and how much you meant to them and how they're trying to live out certain things about you in their own life, and they're only saying good things, what would be 3 things that you really hope that they say about you? And here's the coolest thing, is when we can identify in ourselves, but also help somebody else who might have lived for 75 years, never once articulating what they're for, we'll find that they struggle. We struggle to find that. But then when we find it, all of a sudden, it's like a fountain that was clogged up is now opened. And there's a gushing that happens, because when those 3 principles rise to the surface of consciousness, then all of a sudden we have a capacity to measure and see our behavior, that we're trying to be conscious of our behavior. How does that fall in congruence with, or what kind of incongruity is present between our values and our chosen behavior? Because I would argue that experiencing joy in the present moment, but maybe a future experience of joy, is going to be connected to an inner integration and inner integrity where our values and our behavior are matching. Yeah, it just leads to peace and tranquility. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that resonates. I don't know. I think this is there's a lot in this kind of framework that I think it helps simplify things. It helps kind of foreground, some of the as you say, like there's all this language we could use around these things that would be,
Oh yeah, I'm not at all precise in my definitions. I know that
but I think
drives
it's good.
people crazy.
I think it makes it a good tool to be able to, present this stuff to people in a way that's much more accessible, because it's not, but so some of my thinking around this probably tends towards, hyper complexifying things into too many variables. But I think this is yeah. So anyway, that's just,
well, can we do this with you really quick?
Sure.
Not the full dying and not rise, we're not going to make a Jesus just yet, but you just said complexifying. And I know that is a talent of yours. I think so. I think your gift is to help clarify through seeing the complexification, honoring the complexification of the whole, But I don't think that's a bedrock value. If you could go a little bit deeper, the tendency is to complexify and look at that. But what might be something it births this desire to understand the complexity? Where is that coming from, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think we share that sense of looking for the deep patterns of things. And I guess if you were to try to track that down into its core, I think there's a desire the desire certainly for intelligibility.
But to what purpose? Why?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately for me, all this aims at human, like flourishing.
Yes.
Which is, but then it's like, okay, well, what does one mean by that? And it's
Well, I think most people would understand flourishing, and we don't have to be too nitty gritty here. But what I want to know is flourishing, but why? Why would we want people? Do you want to flourish? Why do you want to help people flourish? Why?
Yeah. Well, I recently wrote kind of a book on that, I guess, to some degree. And
you would write a whole book about something.
Well, I mean, because I do, like, when you get down to first principles and you try to be like, well, why? And you kind of ask, the 2-year-old question of, okay, but why is the sky blue? That sort of a thing, which is good. Like, those are the kinds of questions that should be asked. They kind of do bottom out somewhere. And some people, again, will find where that bottoms out really compelling and really fascinating because it speaks to a certain almost kind of, that makes total sense. It kind of couldn't be otherwise. And that's kind of, assuring and affirming. Other people might hear it and it seems maybe a bit dry or it's lost touch with some of the more kind of with emotional, feeling oriented sort of thing. But I would say something like, if I don't value my own flourishing, I will cease to be. And then if I cease to be, there's not going to be things like me around that are valuing things. So there's a kind of evolutionary accounting for the fact that, like, the things that we do see that do exist are things that have values. By virtue of being in the world, you have to have some values, because if you don't, then you won't be in the world. And so there's kind of you could almost say, like, the very forces of cosmic evolution sort of select for meaning and value in that sense. Not in some, well, certainly profound, but not in some totalizing way that all that meaning and value is going to be the same everywhere all at once. The meaning for the tree and for me and for an animal are going to be different kinds of meanings, but we all share the same impetus to want to continue, to want to then not just continue, but to expand, to thrive, to flourish. And then as that process itself complexifies, you find yourself embedded in networks of other entities doing likewise. And so your flourishing depends on theirs and is intertwined with it. And so on and so forth. So anyway, that's
well, let me, okay. Everything you just said I'm seeing it almost as a beautiful river, but you started out this beautiful river with a statement. I'm not sure if you remember it. It was a statement that was couched in negative. So it was a sacred no. So I'm going to try to see what the sacred yes is. And that was this: if I don't value things, I cease to be. That was sort of like the fount coming out of the ground, and then it just expands into all the ways that you just shared. So I'm interested in right there. If I don't value, I cease to be. Then I'm starting to think, okay, of course, we could talk about what value means. We could talk about what be means. But if I'm going below, and this is where in solidarity, because I know I'm in hope, but I'm going to go try to back to, you're always doing, it's not that when you get to 1, then you go to 2. It's when you get to 2, you're doing 1, 2. And when you get to 3, you're doing 1, 2, 3. Always. You know what I mean? Yeah. So in solidarity, then I'm going to ask you right now could being a witness to this emerging love or reality or divinity or however you want to, that seems to be really important to be a witness, to value. It's almost like a role that you would have is to stand right at the edge of all of this begetting and say, this is valuable. I'm valuing, I'm witnessing and saying this is good. Or I'm getting, there's a value that it's like witnessing with a verb.
I would agree. I mean, I guess for me, a lot of this comes from navigating my own experiences with things like meaning and value and being able to now compare and contrast. So I've done this thing. I've done this thing a certain way. I've seen the world from this perspective. How did that turn out? How did that affect my flourishing? How did that affect the flourishing of people around me, et cetera? And I've gone through a number of iterations of that. So then you can start to look for the patterns, right, that hold across those differences, and then say, hey, there's definitely more in sort of this basic kind of positive negative valence thing going on here. Like this leads to this and this leads to that. And so trying to make sense of all that is valuable. And then also trying to help other people navigate that is very valuable to me.
Because it gives you joy.
Say again?
It gives you joy.
Sure. Yeah. I would count in joy as part of that flourishing bit. Right?
I think that's the ultimate telos.
Yeah.
For me, joy is a sense of experiential wholeness, both in the present moment, but looking forward and anticipating more wholeness and more wholeness. And that's one of the things that I find attractive to your podcast is that there is a joy for you in the unearthing the values of your own values of others, finding meta values, the concentric circles of values. There's a joy that I think was what people are responding to even more than your ideas. Because if you were just reading in a drone kind of monotonous and had no elan vital that's transmitted, people would not be interested in your words or books or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, so that goes both ways as well. I do think that that's true because people are looking for, how does this show up for someone? Is this pleasant? Do I enjoy this? Is there an infectious quality of when I see someone doing something that they enjoy, that I enjoy that? All that's there. We look for that every time we're looking for cues about, what is the significance of something to us. The downside of that is you can also find people who are also joyful about things that are, I would say, not optimal for our understanding and our collective flourishing together, right? And you can also then bring in a lot of people just by putting on a big smile and getting up on stage and singing songs and then, bringing people into an ideology or a religious framework that's actually really harmful and pathological for them. So I don't think it's just joy.
No.
I do think it's like that joy has to, relate to, I will say this, I guess, like, right? Because meaning and value, if they are in alignment with reality and that whole thing is producing a kind of reciprocal opening and transformation and development, learning, etc., then that will be experienced as joy, as positive valence, as the opening and the so that's usually a very good sign that someone is finding something that is moving them in the direction that we are, I think, collectively all looking for in our own way.
But here, let me say this right here, because you're saying I agree with you, and I think that there's an joy there too. And here's what I mean by that: is let's say you and I would share a similar history, that we were very conservative Christians at one point, in our own little rigid ways, huh? And maybe if I've had mystical, joyful experiences inside of that. Looking back, I can see it as a lot of dopamine hits. You know what I mean? It was also a belonging to a community. It was all the light and the shadow that different belief systems have. Sure. And then if we're doing our work, we move from the order box into the disorder or deconstruction box. And people can spend their whole life there. And that's dangerous because it's hard to be there all the time. You want to eventually move into the reorder. But I think part of the reorder and the reconstruction of one's worldview that has meaning and all of the stuff that you and I talk about is going to see that a past moments of joy don't have to be hated on. I don't have to look at my Catholic apologist epic of my life and say, God, dude, you were looking for belonging, and there was a lot of good things that came out of that. It let me grow roots. And then when that didn't work anymore, it led me to deconstruction. So I can honor that too. So moments of joy in the past, and then my present joy that I'm feeling is experienced because I'm including and then transcending. It's almost the opposite of maybe what Ken Wilber would say is you transcend then include. I'm trying to say you include it, and that is transcending.
Yeah, I wouldn't, depending on how one parses all that, there's certainly a way that I could say yes to that. There is also, there is the joy. Maybe, again, this is all
Joy being
interpretation.
Hitler in Germany and
Well, yeah, I know. I mean, I just think of like the 6-year-old boy with a BB gun going out to the swamp and shooting frogs, right? Like maybe there's a kind of joy in that. And then later on, you look back on that, and I didn't do that. I'm just saying, but like we all have those kinds of things that that when we were young, we were like, oh man, and hopefully we do, because it shows that we've grown and we've developed. And so those are our ways of being that I think we actually we do ourselves a service by being able to move beyond and then in retrospect account for as being maybe necessary but not,
integration. You don't have to,
right.
It's good to start at early stages of spirituality, but very dangerous to stay there.
Right. So yeah, the only thing about some of the transcend and include or include and transcend languaging that can sometimes, I feel like, miss some important developmental movement or a dynamic of the movement is that there is real change there as well. We're not always including everything. There's not a way that let's say I did do that when I was a kid, and it's not like, oh yeah, and I still have that as part of me. So every 6 weeks I take the BB gun out and I go to the swamp, and that's to ensure that I can integrate that part of myself. It's like there's a way Wilber talks about this in The Religion of Tomorrow, where he uses the metaphor of a ladder, and in order to go up the ladder, you have to include every rung that came before. But as you move up that ladder, your view is actually changing, right? Your view is not the conglomeration of all the views that came before. By the time you're at the 8th rung, it's a very different view than when you're on, say, the 2nd rung. And so there is like some genuinely real change and transformation that happens as we move up, even as we can also allow for the idea that like we do that by means of building up these earlier sentiments or sediments. So anyway, I mean, again, this is pedantry, parsing things in this way.
No,
but I feel like
you're picking up what I'm saying here, because that's process.
Yeah.
That's going to the P, process. Okay. And what I would like to do is maybe think about it of we're on the ladder, but the ladder is a spiral. And so the view is much more expansive. We can see further around. But if we're looking down, we'll see the concentric circle.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I do the both and there.
Yeah, I like that.
Metanoia is concentric circles, is getting bigger and bigger. That can see, let's say if I don't believe and I don't like hunting, but most of the people I know in Texas hunt, and I don't think it's terrible either. But at the same time, I have no desire to do that. And I used to when I was a kid. I never really liked it, but I mean, what else are you going to do in Texas? Play baseball, football, and hunt. But the way I see that in myself now is the experience of being in nature and the experience of being in a community of other guys, mostly it was guys, that were hunting and all of that stuff. Those were pretty cool things, man. The time I got to spend with my dad, at that point, we didn't have a whole lot of communication. And when I talk to people today who are avid hunters, I mean, addicted to it, is it really they're addicted to the adrenaline of killing something? I don't think so. Not the people I talk to. I don't care how gun NRA and all of this stuff they are. They go hunting, especially men, because there's a primal connection to liminal space where they don't have to be something. They can just be one with the nature, connect with other people, and there's probably a lot of drinking, but that serves to kind of soften the edges in a world that you can't be soft,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think probably a lot of sports solidarity is a similar sort of thing. It's not.
Yeah.
I mean, most. I guess like that's the charitable reading of a lot of collective rituals that we do, is that it's not the ostensible thing, on the surface. It's actually the occasion and the context and the relationships that get formed and the deeper psychological bonding and all that stuff.
So I'm going to circle back, because trusting the process is something that ships approach people. We need to get really comfortable in ourselves, is that we're on a developmental role. And I think that's one of your greatest gifts, is that you are a student, a life student, and therefore a great teacher of these different maps of consciousness, And I like the metamodern impulse here, because it doesn't feel as dogmatic. And this is my bias, maybe. Dogmatic is say, the yellow level in spiral dynamics or the integral. And I'm not throwing any of those out of the bus. It feels to me as a layman looking at Metamodern is that we're all we are literally in the process of understanding what process might look like.
Yeah, I like that. That's pretty meta. It's a process
We're
of
all
understanding
walking
the process.
ourselves home to arm in arm in whatever telos this is leading, but it's probably going to be something like wholeness. It's leading us somewhere, even if it's just right in the immediacy of the now. And then we're awakening to it. So process inside of process, I kind of lump some of these things like understanding someone's psychological development, someone's spiritual development. Fowler is helpful in this, the stages of faith. I also find I do a lot of training on the Enneagram, but when I do the training of the Enneagram, the first half of a presentation is always going to be about what does it look like to begin at a pretty rigid dualistic ego state, and then how does it feel and look like to become, how does metanoia track for a 2 or a 5 or a 3? And so I have a whole way to talk about the Enneagram that honors the developmental stages. It's in the act of becoming, you see. So process, not only do we come from a process and society is in a process, I think for example, the Bible that Christians use, if you take the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures all together, I'm borrowing from Richard Rohr. I think he was Standing on the Shoulders of Others, but you can see almost a text in travail, humans awakening to the nature of an I thou that mirrored the developmental consciousness level early on. You've written on this, I think, too, and then you have it's almost 3 steps forward and then 2 steps back, and then a 3 forward and 2 steps back. And by the end, you get something like the nature of God is kenosis, self-emptying vulnerability, the power of the cross, the folly of the cross, that resurrection necessitates dying, that the resurrected body, the perfected body, say, has scars that never healed. How do we understand that kind of wholeness when we are putting it together with a God that is, demands purity or smiting enemies? Well, it's not that the Hebrew, it's all one text that shows the 3 steps forward and 2 steps back of human consciousness in some way, I find that to be true on the individual level too. And so understanding the process is something that is immediately freeing of not needing to be perfect right now, because I'm walking the journey and the whole point is to walk that together. And then lastly, service. And I got to tell you, this is a big one because core spiritual traditions often have some kind of level of service inside of them, but even psychology in the past 10 years has really studied the efficacy of inviting clients to do service as a part of their psychological interventions to help them deal with depression or anxiety or lack of motivation. And it is as effective in some ways as other things like antidepressants or different kinds of modes of talk therapy. Just getting someone to be accountable to the counselor and to themselves of doing some kind of loving service beyond the transactional, I'm going to do this, so you're going to do that. Beyond the transactional is itself a tool to help people feel better. And maybe you and I would say, yeah, that's absolutely it's common sense. But look what you're doing. I mean, it would be an interesting study if you were to invite people who are wanting to participate in your Sky Meadow experiment where they come out and they stay with you, but then they work, like a before and after kind of conversations as to how do they feel more integrated or something like that. My guess is that there's going to be a sense of a gestalt. Adding all these things that I've done doesn't equal how I'm experiencing reality, right? It's bigger than that. What do you think?
Yeah, I do think, certainly service is I'll put it this way, I guess. The depression that I think a lot of people are experiencing can, I think, directly be related to the meaning crisis, lack of meaning, lack of a sense of appreciation for the reality of value. And so, I mean, when you just try to throw certain kinds of medications at that, for a lot of the population, that's actually not, that's going to be maybe not even treating the symptom, let alone the cause. And so there's something obviously much deeper there that's at the psychological, social level. And big aspect of that is, yeah, we are isolated, alienated from one another. And so I think whenever you bring back to people's attention the importance of connection, community, being responsible for other people, for caring about other people, all these things, right? You're inherently going to be returning a sense of meaning and value to people's lives. And then that is, I think, for many people, going to have a reciprocal opening effect, because this will be the thing that people have been missing, what they've been lacking. And so, and of course, one always has to make room allowance for, there are cases where there are just, chemical imbalances.
Of course,
like
yeah.
But I don't think that the kind of collective cultural malaise and meaning crisis and sense of sort of cultural depression that I think a lot of people are experiencing is that. I think I just saw a graph of the number of minutes a day that people spend with friends, and it's shocking. I mean, it's depressing. It's awful. It's just this precipitous decline. And of course, one can interpret something like that multiple ways, whether that has to be in person or even just in kind of, communication with. But we are, becoming more isolated, alienated, and sort of removed from the very things that give us meaning and value. So bringing in service in an intentional way is like an obvious kind of medicine, you could say, but also, it's the medicine we need at so many levels, at both the psychological level, but also the collective level, because we have a society that is no longer rendering acts of service to each other. So the whole fabric is sort of eroded there. And then we, I guess, are expected to rely upon the state or something to fill the gaps. And then when it doesn't, or when it's incompetent, or when there's not enough money, or whatever the thing is, the excuse is that, isn't solving the problem, people get bitter and resentful. And then, and it's just this kind of negative building on negative. So totally agree.
Yeah. I think it's a question of, we just get a little flabby in some of our ways to be human. And here's what I have found is all of what you've said, especially young adults spending a lot of time online. And although there have been good connections, people are making connections in some of the ways that are satisfying to them, forming relationships, doing video games and working together. At the same time, there is something to be said about embodiment and being in the presence of others. And here's the thing, though, that's so freeing for people is somebody maybe who's 25 and has very few friends and very few opportunities to even connect with other people embodied. Mm-hmm. Once they can pick one person, so I'm always very particular, I'll be like, okay, how about between now and next week when we see each other, what is one person in your life that you might be able to do something extra beyond transactional? And they name that person and they name what they're going to do very specifically. And then I'm going to say, I'm so excited to hear you say that, because that's the first thing I'm going to ask you is how that experience was for you. How did it help you? So I'm couching it in positive terms because I'm enthusiastic to hear their results, because it's always positive. And what ends up happening is just that one little act is like they start flexing a muscle that was always there, but maybe a little weak, a little latent, but you don't have to go back and live 25 years to get it strong. It's as if once you just tap it, it's as if it just starts growing. And then the person themselves, this is the whole point of counseling, by the way, the person themselves starts to say, oh, the more I do for others, the more that I turn this off, social media, whatever it is, and be in the presence of others, the better I feel. Well, shoot, I'm going to do it. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost an immediate way for them to realize that they've been holding their hand on fire for all these years, not knowing that they have the power to take off the hand.
Mm.
And so the human nature, by nature, because we're all cells in one body, to use a Christian term, are all somehow interconnected, relational from the very beginning. This is so natural for us that if we could just activate that little muscle, then it starts to almost rearrange our way to navigate. Whereas what used to give us anxiety all of a sudden fits inside of, this is just how it is to be human. And my insecurities aren't bad. They're helping me learn how to heal and examine things in the past that have happened to me with some mercy.
Well, wonderful. I mean, so we've gone through now the ships. We've gone through the acronym. We've kind of you've touched on each one of those and kind of unpacked them a bit. So, thank you very much for that. And I hope this gives people a sense of this, and kind of how it hangs together. In starting to kind of wrap this up, is there anything you'd want to throw into now that you've gone through that, kind of summarize or bring anything else in? I think you had some more slides too that we didn't really wind up getting to.
It's okay. This is the most important.
But yeah. So, anything else to kind of that you would want to include in this overview of this?
I would, and it's simple. Well, I guess the first thing I'd like to say is if anybody would be interested in talking about some of these things or are communicating with me in any way, I have two websites. One is DougScottCounseling.com. The other one is CosmicChrist.net. That's where I've written so many things, and I have a podcast there that I've explored a lot of these things. Also the esoteric stuff too. Mm-hmm. So if you want to fire me as heretical, then there's some proof. But I'd like to say that I'm inviting myself and everybody here. First off, try this out, because my guess is that in anybody who's listening right now, if you have done something in life and you feel pretty good about it, you feel like you're hitting a stride and feeling some sense of, you had a conversation, you feel really good about it, or you're writing a book and you feel good about it. My guess is that it's going to have gone through some act of connecting at the depths. That's solidarity. Some sense of incarnating hope, finding hope, the seeds of hope inside of us and growing that. Some sense of process, certainly developmental, that there's a baby that grows up, some kind of idea that grows up. And lastly, that there was an incarnation of any concepts. There was an incarnation of the lived experiential reality that is yours. But if you want to keep it, we incarnate it and give it away. So that's what I see you doing. For me, and I've mentioned this when you and I talked alone, is that your whole project, because I get to witness your witnessing, if you will. That's kind of metamodern, right? Witnessing the witness that you're giving to the valuing and all this. I sense a desire that we're all human. We're all trying to make sense of all of this. Vervanke does the same thing. All of your guests have done the same thing. They're coming from their own desire to connect and to give people hope in the conversation. You really do a good job asking questions. You're entering the view. Sometimes it's to walk with them. Sometimes it's to challenge them. And that is a gift of yours, huh?
Thank you.
You acknowledge the process of things. And then lastly, the very act, it's almost, for you, it seems like it's a baby that you can't help but do. That is to disseminate this information. No one's asking you to do it at first, at least. Now they are, because they see how brilliant you are. But it's more of like, you're doing what is yours to do. There's a sense of that. I'm here to do what I am here to do. And you're writing books and you're doing interviews and you're doing conferences. That's what I mean. That's how you keep your embeddedness here in this earth going, by continuing to serve and give people opportunity to enter into dialogue with you. Well, I think everybody is doing this. I'm just asking us to do it intentionally.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And clearly this is your version of that, of reflecting on, these processes, as you said, and then trying to find ways to help people, to be of service to people by becoming consciously aware of them, and then in the process, of course, then being able to get better at it by knowing what the kind of different steps, what the different movements are. So thank you for that. And on the point of asking questions, I appreciate that. I almost feel like I didn't ask you very good questions this round, because there's something about the slide element of it sort of like giving you more like presentation mode status. I mean, I didn't want to kind of interrupt your flow too much, but I appreciate you in some ways asking me the questions so that we could.
Oh, I'm so glad you didn't ask me questions, because you're so intelligent. I'd be like, oh my God, I don't know how to answer. No.
Well,
I like talking.
No, but you're right though. I think, I mean, that everyone that, well, I'd say everyone that I want to bring on and have conversations with on this podcast are doing some form of that, and yourself included is trying to share, these things and be of service to people. So
Yeah.
I hope this is valuable to folks and is of service to them. And as Doug said, check out his stuff, and I assume get in touch with you. It sounds like if people are interested to learn more about this. And
happy.
Cool. Wonderful. Well, Doug Scott, thank you so much. Much appreciated. Thank you for taking the time. And in this graphic, it's been up the whole time, so I think it'll be etched in people's memory indelibly from now on. So the ship's process. What would you call this? The ship's method? The ship's.
I just call it the ship's approach.
The ship's approach. Oh yeah, the whole word there. But you know what? It was under the surface, so I didn't see it.
See, it's always hidden under the surface.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. God bless.